Um, I know that this will probably not shock you, but I hate to say this, but not everything Donald Trump said tonight was true or accurate. Tonight, when we talk about the economy, tonight and on numerous occasions since he has taken office, President Trump has told the American people that the U.S. economy is the hottest economy anywhere in the world, that it is really booming. Well, that may be true for the members of his Mar-a-Lago country club where the price is $100,000. For those folks who go to Trump's club and for the wealthiest people in our nation, Trump is right. The economy is really booming. In fact, for many of President Trump's billionaire friends, the truth is they have never, ever had it so good. But for the middle class and for the working families of our country, the truth is that the economy is not so great. Over the last year, for example, real inflation accounted for wages for the average American worker is up by all of 1.2%, just $9.11 a week. In fact, real wages for that same worker, that average American worker, are lower today than they were in 1973. Let me repeat that. The average American worker, after adjusting for inflation, is earning less today than he or she did 46 years ago, despite huge increases in productivity. Sadly, millions of American workers are now forced to work 2 or 3 jobs just to pay the bills and to keep their heads above water economically. In America today, and somehow or another, President Trump didn't mention this in his speech, we have more wealth than who own more wealth than the bottom half of our country, 160 million Americans. Yes, the economy is great for the top 1%, who now earn 46% of all new income in our economy. Yes, the economy is great for the top 25 hedge fund managers on Wall Street, who made nearly twice as much income last year as all 140,000 kindergarten teachers in our country. 25 hedge fund managers. Yeah, the economy is great for the 5 richest people in America who have seen their wealth go up by over $100 billion since Trump was elected, and for corporations that have announced over $1 trillion in stock buybacks in 2018 alone. Yes, the economy may be great for those folks, but it is absolutely not booming for the nearly 80% of American workers who live paycheck to paycheck, desperately hoping that their child doesn't get sick, praying that their car doesn't break down, or that they don't lose their job. Despite what President Trump says, this is not a hot economy when 43% of households can't afford to pay for housing, food, childcare, healthcare, transportation, and a cell phone without going into debt. That is not a hot economy for ordinary Americans. The economy is not booming when half of Americans 55 years of age and older have no idea how they will live out the last years of their lives with dignity because they have no retirement savings. It includes, unbelievably, 20% of seniors trying to survive on incomes of less than $14,000 a year. And I just don't know how anybody certainly not a senior citizen, survives on $14,000 a year. This is not the strongest economy we have ever had, according to Trump, when hundreds of thousands of young people are unable to go to college because they can't afford it, and millions more are struggling with outrageous levels of student debt, when over 34 million Americans have no health insurance, when 1 out of 5 of our people cannot afford the medicine prescribed to them by their doctors, and when over 40 million people in our country are living in poverty. This is not an economy we should be proud of when we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the developed world, and when life expectancy in the United States has actually gone down for the 3rd year in a row. And as we speak tonight, let us not forget that in America, millions of our people are working for starvation wages, $8 an hour, $9 an hour, $10 an hour. And here is the minimum wage to a living wage, at least $15 an hour. Somehow didn't talk about that. Tonight, President Trump talked about what a great job he has done on trade. Is that the annual trade deficit has gone up by over $100 billion since he became president, and our trade deficit with China and Mexico has gone up by tens of billions of dollars. Meanwhile, since Trump was elected, corporations have shipped 185,000 American jobs overseas. President Trump also talked tonight about the need to rebuild our country's crumbling infrastructure, our roads and our bridges and our water systems and our wastewater plants. And he is absolutely right. It is an absolute disgrace that in the wealthiest nation on earth we have an infrastructure that is crumbling. But the proposal highways, our bridges, and other vital infrastructure to Wall Street, to wealthy campaign contributors, even to foreign governments. The reality is that Trump's plan to privatize our nation's infrastructure is an old idea that has never worked and, in fact, never will work. President Trump said tonight, quote, "We are born free," end of quote. Well, I say to President Trump, people are not truly free when they can't afford to go to the doctor when they are sick. People are not truly free when they cannot afford to buy drugs they desperately need. People are not truly free when they are unable to retire with dignity. People are not truly free when they are. People are not truly free when they cannot afford a decent place in which to live. People certainly are not free when they cannot afford to feed their families. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1968, and I quote, "This country has social the poor," end quote. What Dr. King said then was true, and it is true today, and it remains absolutely unacceptable. Tonight, Donald Trump, who in less than 2 years in the White House has seen 5 aides either plead guilty or be convicted of criminal charges, claimed the strength of the economy was dependent on being free from necessary oversight and investigations into wrongdoing by both his campaign and his administration. The exact opposite is true. America's strength is based on the rule of law and the fact that no one, not even the President of the United States, is above it. Tonight, in terms of crime, Trump talked about a terrible and heinous murder in Reno, Nevada, committed by an undocumented immigrant who happens to be Latino. In fact, as I think you recall, over the last several years, Trump has talked time and time again about crimes committed by undocumented Latino immigrants. His demonization of Latinos is nothing less than racist. It is wrong, and it also happens to be factually inaccurate. Undocumented Latino immigrants commit fewer crimes in the United States than the general public. But I want you to think about something for a moment. Isn't it strange that when we talk about terrible crimes committed in the state of Nevada, Donald Trump forgot to mention that in 2017, a white man named Stephen Paddock killed 58 people and wounded 851 in the deadliest shooting in modern American history. That also happened in Nevada. Now, how come he is concerned about crime? How come Trump didn't talk about one of the worst mass murders in? Needless to say, he also didn't mention the need for common sense gun safety legislation, which would lower the terrible rate of mass shootings in our country. Tonight, Donald Trump repeated some of the most extreme anti-woman attacks coming from the far right. At a time when we see an unprecedented and coordinated attack against a woman's right to choose, it is incredibly important that every woman in this country has the right to control her own body. Tonight, Donald Trump correctly talked about the need to address the opioid crisis. Well, President Trump, which calls for $1 trillion cut to Medicaid. That would be a devastating moment in the fight against opioid addiction. Important as it is to respond to what President Trump said tonight, it is even more important to discuss some of what Trump refused to talk about, which happens to include some of the most important issues facing our country and the entire world. Now, how can a president of the United States heard about climate change when the leading scientists of the world tell us that climate change is climate change is already causing devastating harm in the United States and in much of the world. Further, the scientists tell us that we have in order to transform our energy system away from fossil fuels and into energy efficiency and sustainable energy, if we are going to have a planet that is healthy and habitable for our children and our grandchildren. Somehow or another, Donald Trump just forgot to talk about that. National embarrassment of the United States being the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right. That we spend far more per capita on health care than any other country on earth, while at or underinsured. Somehow or another, Trump forgot to get to that issue. How can President Trump not discuss the terrible attacks that we are seeing to undermine the fundamentals of American democracy, which includes the disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision that allows billionaires to buy elections? Trump talked a lot about freedom tonight, but somehow or another, he didn't talk about governors' efforts all across this country, governors who are trying to suppress the vote and make it harder for poor people or people of color to vote. You can't talk about freedom in America and ignore the massive amounts of voter suppression taking place, denying people the right to participate in our democracy. The economy. But he forgot to mention the fact that state after state is doing the right thing and is raising the minimum. President Trump say that he would work with me and with other advocates of a living wage to raise the minimum wage at the federal level to $15 an hour. Somehow didn't get into that. Security, Medicare, or Medicaid in his State of the Union speech when he promised over and over again during his campaign, you remember that? That he would not cut these programs. Could it be because his budget proposed massive cuts to Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security in direct violation of his campaign pledge? How could Trump not talk about the reality that Russia, through cyber warfare, interfered in our election in 2016, is interfering in democratic elections all over the world, and according to the heads of his own national security agencies, attempted to interfere in the 2018 midterm elections? How can the president say nothing about Yemen, where the humanitarian crisis where the worst humanitarian crisis in the world is currently taking place, brought on by a Saudi-led war that the United States fighters in Yemen and have also fallen into the hands of Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. This war is a disaster, which is why the Senate passed a resolution that I sponsored last December, calling on the president to end our support for that terrible war, and why colleagues in both the House and the Senate reintroduced that legislation last week. This is an enormously important foreign policy issue. It speaks to our relationship with a despotic regime in Saudi Arabia. Somehow Trump forgot to mention that. President Trump has and over and over and over and over again that building a wall on the Mexican border is a national emergency. In fact, he shut down the government and federal employees who were forced to go to work but were not paid, all because of his insistence on that wall. No, President Trump, building a wall is not an emergency. In terms of immigration in this country, what we need to do is not to waste billions on a wall, but to finally address the need for comprehensive immigration reform, including a path to citizenship for millions of undocumented that tiny children at the border have been torn apart from their parents. It is disgraceful that 1.8 million young people raised in the United States and who know no other country but the United States have lost their legal protection under the DACA program because of Trump's actions. It is heartbreaking that almost 11 million undocumented people living in this country, the overwhelming majority of whom are hard and law-abiding, worry every day about being deported and separated from their loved ones. What a president of the United States is supposed to do, and I think in a certain sense almost all you bring our people together, whether they're black or white or Latino, whether they're Asian American, Native American, whether they're men or women, whether they're gay or straight. That's what a president is supposed to do. But in an unprecedented way, that is not what this president is doing. In fact, he is trying to divide us up. He is trying to have one group turn against another group. And that is certainly not what this country is supposed to be about. Trump said tonight that we should, quote, govern not as two parties, but as one nation. I agree. But Trump's agenda of providing tax breaks to billionaires while throwing millions of Americans off of health insurance, if Trump truly wants to govern in a bipartisan manner, let's take a look at what the overwhelming majority of the American people want. In other words, I know this is a radical idea, but I say to the President of the United States, why don't you do what the American people want you to do rather than what wealthy campaign contributors conducted last month shows that 70% of Americans support a tax increase on families making over $10 million. According to Reuters, 70% of the American people, including 52% of Republicans, is not working, and they want to join every other country on earth in making health care a right, not a privilege. Another poll found that 72% of the American people, including 51% of Republicans, want to expand Social Security benefits, make sure that our elderly people can retire in dignity, increasing taxes on millionaires and billionaires. According to Gallup, 76% of the American people, including large majorities of Republicans and Democrats, want 15 million good-paying jobs. The Kaiser Family Foundation has found that 92% of Americans want Medicare to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies to lower prescription drug prices. That same poll also found that 72% of Americans, including 3/4 of Republicans, want the freedom to buy low-cost prescription drugs from Canada. Gallup tells us that 64% of Americans, including 51% of Republicans, believe marijuana should be legal. And that tells me that we should end the disastrous war on drugs. Quinnipiac tells us that Americans support by over 94%, requiring background checks for all gun purchases. CBS has found that 87% of Americans, including 79% of Republicans, want to allow immigrants who are brought to the United States as children to stay in our country. By the Koch brothers, 66% of Americans believe, quote, government-paid college tuition is an effective solution to social barriers. 65% of Americans believe that a $15 minimum wage is an effective solution to low wages. 69% of Americans believe that we need more regulation of Wall Street. And 69% of Americans also believe we should be increasing government assistance for child care. My fellow Americans, if the overwhelming majority of Americans want us to pass these enormous enormous. Why isn't Congress and the White House doing what the American people want them to do? And the answer, frankly, is not complicated. The answer has everything to do with the power of the moneyed interests. Wall Street, big drug companies, huge health insurance companies, the fossil fuel industry, multinational corporations, millions of dollars to get Congress to do their bidding. But while they may have the money, and God only knows they have an endless supply of money, we have something that is more powerful on our side, and that is that we have the people. They have the money, we have the people. If we are serious about transforming our country, if we are serious about rebuilding the shrinking middle class, for democracy and increasing voter turnout and bringing young people into the political process, let us bring our people together to take on and defeat a ruling class whose greed is destroying our nation. The billionaire class must learn that they cannot have it all. Our government belongs to each and every one of us, not just the few. Together, let us fight for economic, social, racial, and environmental justice. Let us end unbridled greed. Let us create the kind of America that we know we can become. Thank you all, and have a great night.